This is the United States Energy Association Power Sector Podcast, sponsored by global energy law firm Bracewell LLP. I'm Herman K. Trabish. I've covered the power sector since 2006, and I currently report for Utility Dive. In this episode of the podcast series on offshore wind, we're going to talk to BJ Martino, a partner in the Republican political research and strategy firm Tarrance Group, about his 2025 survey of public attitudes toward offshore wind. He's going to describe the significant majority of voters from both political parties that favor U.S. offshore wind development, even as policymakers continue to create siting and permitting barriers for projects. BJ's work with the Tarrance Group in political research and consulting has included over 30 statewide campaigns, dozens of congressional campaigns, and projects for the Republican National Committee and the National Republican Congressional Committee. BJ was named the 2012 Republican Strategist of the Year and the 2021 Republican Pollster of the Year by the American Association of Political Consultants. So, BJ, when was this landmark survey about offshore wind done? What states did you survey? And tell me, what is the overall impression the survey gives us about the public's attitude toward offshore wind?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Herman. I appreciate being allowed to come on and talk about these responses. We conducted interviews among more than 5,700 voters across 12 coastal states, from Maine, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut up in the Northeast, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina in the Mid-Atlantic region, Texas, Louisiana along the Gulf, and finally California and Oregon on the Pacific coast. We conducted these interviews in January of this year, from the 14th to the 26th. There was a number of interviews, so there was a little bit larger field window. And within this project, each state was polled on its own. So that means that I took each state independently and made sure that it was representative along the voter electorate among geographic, demographic, and partisan lines. And as you said, we found across all of these states consistent majorities in support of offshore wind projects in their state. Across all the states, 64%, in fact, said that they were in favor of the construction of offshore wind projects to harness wind energy in the U.S. waters off their coast. You said it was bipartisan.
Almost two-thirds of all the people you surveyed basically accepted offshore wind.
They do, and there are some factors that drive that, and we can get into some of the existing opinions that voters have. But as you said, it's bipartisan. Now, not surprisingly, Democratic voters are some of the most supportive, 80% in favor of offshore wind. 60% of independent voters, who are oftentimes the critical voters in any election, 60% said they were in favor of offshore wind. Among Republicans, there were some more mixed opinions. Overall, across all the states, it was 46% in favor, 53% opposed initially, but that just only highlights the opportunity to engage and build support within some of that part of the electorate for whom they probably don't know as much about the issue and about some of the potential benefits.
All right, we're going to get into a lot of those details. Well, the first detail I do want to mention is that Republican reluctance toward offshore wind is unique because a lot of the jobs and benefits will go into Republican districts. It may be tied, a lot of reporting has tied it to the president's concern that made it an executive order opposing offshore wind a day one priority. But that stems back to an experience he had between 2013 and 2015 in Scotland, when he felt it was impeding on the value of his golf resort. But that's such a long time ago. Offshore wind is nothing like the offshore wind that he ran into trouble with. So let's get into some of the details. How did the public response to offshore wind break down? Demographically, geographically, were there particulars you discovered about the type of project in this survey? Tell me, go into some detail.
Sure. Well, across the states, support ranged from the lows of 56% in Maine, 57% in New Jersey. Those were the lowest states, but still significant majorities. It climbed into the 60s across most of the rest of the states, hit a high of 68% in Virginia and fully 71% of voters in Massachusetts. But what's interesting is that even in more traditionally Republican states like Texas, they registered 66% in favor of offshore wind in their state. And I think there's some factors that could be involved in that. Republicans in Texas more supportive than the Republican base overall across the states that we measured. But that
Yeah,
makes sense for a state like Texas. They are an energy producing state. They have familiarity with offshore energy forms. So there was a comfort level there, which, not to say that that is a surprising result, but was interesting to see that those Texas voters had that level of support. Now,
Texas is
demographically,
Texas is the leading wind producer in the country, and so they also have familiarity with wind and understand that it does more for their economy than any kind of harm that it might do.
yeah, absolutely. When we look at the
Oh,
demographics,
excuse me, BJ. I'm
yeah,
really sorry to
certainly.
interrupt you again. Apology, but
No,
I also wanted to mention Texas wind began with the Republican Governor George W. Bush. He was the one that initiated that. So another reason for the state to support wind.
that's a great point. We look at the demographics of this too. You see support for offshore wind highest among the 18 to 44-year-old cohort. They were at 69% in support of offshore wind across the states. And that's notable. But when you look across gender, age, education level, those in favor of offshore wind held above 60% across all of these subgroups of the
Hmm.
electorate. There was not any particular demographic group that dropped off significantly. Also, we asked ethnicity. Hispanic voters at 63%, African American voters at 72%, white voters at 64%. And I think both the age and that ethnicity question is interesting because there was so much focus and attention being paid by both parties in this last election cycle. Republicans made gains with some of these groups, and Democratic strategists are figuring out how to win some of them back in 2026. So they're critically important demographic subgroups in this discussion. So you put all this together and you see independent voters where they are. You see some of those critical demographic groups that both parties are going to be continuing to fight over. And you can see how this issue could potentially play out.
This episode is brought to you by the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell, where law, policy, and strategic communications intersect to help clients navigate what's next. At Bracewell, we know energy. It's the industry we serve, the power behind big ideas, and the force we bring to every challenge. For nearly 80 years, our firm has helped industry leaders tackle high-stakes challenges with creativity, precision, and results. Bracewell's DC-based policy resolution group helps clients anticipate what's coming so they can shape what's possible. From chaos to clarity. Learn more at bracewell.com/PRG.
I think what you're suggesting is that perhaps these important groups that where the Republicans made gains in the 2024 election might be somewhat alienated by a Republican resistance to offshore wind. Is that the kind of the conclusion that you would draw from what you're saying?
I think alienated might be a strong
Yeah,
term to
sorry.
use, but
Yeah.
certainly they are predisposed to be supportive of offshore wind. And so it is one piece of information, certainly, when they take things into account, but they have a lot of other things that they take into account when they're voting. But this is certainly one. You look at those groups, we don't have to convince them necessarily. And it's not a place for a group you can reinforce and certainly motivate some of them. But we're starting off with significant majorities of some very important demographic subgroups who are already supportive.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the other side of the coin. I've seen as a journalist some misguided disinformation in the media. Um, I think that it, there's discussion about wind's environmental and economic impacts. What did the survey show about what the public is actually concerned about with offshore wind?
Well, the one thing that we've continued to see across all polling, not just here, but and through last year, is ongoing voters' economic concerns. They're concerned about their own cost of living. They're concerned about the economy and their jobs and can they feed their families. So that is something that they look at every issue through the lens of how does this impact me and my family in terms of our ability to get by in my neighborhood and my area where I live. And this is really an opportunity to highlight how offshore wind can drive down energy costs, but also create good paying jobs, strengthen these local economies where they are. It's countering that narrative that's out there that's about cost, that it costs more. So despite some of these concerns about cost that voters have, there's already, we asked about strong agreement about some statements before we started to give anyone new information and test sort of what they would think about some pieces of information. We said, do you think that it creates good paying jobs? And we found strong agreement on that issue. We asked that it's a responsible source of energy, that it makes the US more energy independent. All of these things we found between 50 or 65 and 68% of voters saying that, yes, I agree with these statements about offshore wind. So knowing that we're already walking into this discussion, although voters certainly are going to be fixated on costs, they're already understanding that offshore wind creates good paying jobs. It's good for our economy. Then you can get into things like uh, shipbuilding, port infrastructure, manufacturing, those sorts of good jobs and the impact it has on those local economies. They begin to get that. It's reinforcing for them. Um, and we just see a broad support for incorporating more renewable energy into their mix. We asked voters about just broadly at the beginning of the survey. 73% said they approve of more renewable energy in their state. And like I said, 66 agree it's a responsible source of energy. So when we start talking to some voters and we know that opponents tend to fixate on cost because that's where voters' heads are at and they're very concerned about that, we have some very strong arguments to make about the impact it can have on local economies, how it can create good paying jobs. And voters are already there. They believe those things.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit more based on your survey. I do want to mention that as a journalist, the reason I got into covering this subject matter 20 years ago, almost, is the phrase "green is the new red, white, and blue." I mean, it's a patriotic cause for me. Um, but did the survey show anything about how to best interact with people to make them aware of all these opportunities that they could have from offshore wind? What's the what are the words to use, BJ?
Sure. Well, I think voters are definitely interested in hearing about the specifics. They believe and understand implicitly that offshore wind is good for creating good paying jobs. It's good for the US economy. It's responsible. It helps with energy independence. But let's start putting some meat on the bone for voters with that. What does that mean to them? We tested knowing that there's 6 billion in federal revenue and 25 billion in new investments that are going to infrastructure, and that even increases support further. And that's among those independents and Republicans alike. But moving outside of the research in this project, we know that the capacity to take those big statistics and big numbers and localize the success stories make them so much more effective for voters. When judging the economy or any economic benefits, voters look within their families, they look within their towns and their regions first to judge is something good or bad for us economically. And so taking it from big billions of dollars, which many voters have a hard time comprehending large numbers, they know it's good, but now can we tell stories about an American worker who was trained up and is now making a good living for their family, that is worth far much more than just being able to tell a statistic. And yeah. And when we talk about U.S. energy independence, I think the same lessons apply. We know that offshore wind's affordable and reliable, protect consumers from price spikes, stabilize energy prices, but knowing that it's getting to their own family's protection, their own energy bill, that this idea of independence is a good per se, but what does that really mean for me? It means that when we have sufficient offshore wind built, there'll be more protected from those price spikes and destabilization from foreign sources of energy. That's what matters to me, is now my family is protected. Now my family can make a budget on our energy prices going forward. So it's taking these big numbers that we have and that we like to throw around, but how do we communicate it to voters? It's making sure we make it meaningful to them.
Great. Okay, that's a great place to leave it, BJ. Thank you so much. I got to thank my guest, BJ Martino, a partner with the Tarrance Group. He's described the Republican Strategy Consultants 2025 survey results of public attitudes toward offshore wind. And it found that a significant majority of U.S. voters from both political parties support U.S. offshore wind development, even as policymakers threaten to create barriers for projects. I also want to thank our sponsor, Bracewell LLP. And as always, I want to thank our listeners for taking the time to check out the USEA Power Sector Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share with everybody you know our quest for energy transition solutions.